All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. For those of you who were at my Zoom session yesterday and saw how sick I am, don't worry. I came prepared this time. I've got my Kleenex. I don't know if you can see it. It's blurring it out. I've got my lozenges. I've got my water. So I'm super bassy, but I am ready to go. And I'm excited to be with you all today to talk about the 5 traits of a successful MBA application. But before I do that, let me just introduce myself to you in case you have never met me before. Hi, my name is Maria Wich-Vila. I'm a 2005 graduate of Harvard Business School, and I'm the founder of ApplicantLab.com, which is a DIY online option for you to get the sort of guidance that you might otherwise get from an expensive admissions consultant, but on your own schedule, on your own time, at a much more affordable price point. So if you're new to looking into the MBA application process, you might have started to look into what admissions consultants charge. It can easily surpass $350 an hour. What I have done in Applicant Lab is I have taken my now 20 years. I have been giving admissions advice for 20 years. The bad news is that makes me feel super old. But the good news is it means that I know a lot and I can share that with you. And I do through the ApplicantLab.com platform. So in Applicant Lab, what I've done is I have taken all of the things that I have learned over the years and I have distilled it into a series of steps and lessons that cost for less than what you would otherwise have to pay for 1 hour of my time. You get access to all of it. And in fact, GMAT Club members get a 10% off discount with the highly creative, very, very creative discount code GMAT Club 10 for 10% off. So just with that out of the way, today's topic, top 5 things of an effective MBA application. So let me just start off by telling you, what are we not going to talk about today? I am not going to start off, or I'm not going to cover today, what are 5 things that are parts of an application. I assume that you either already know, or if you don't, that you're going to quickly educate yourself on what are the things that go into an application in terms of the nuts and bolts, right? That you know that you need to have a resume, you might need to write one or several essays, you might need one or multiple recommendations, there's going to be an interview, etc. So I'm not going to patronize you and be like, here are the 5 things that go into an application from in terms of like what actually is an application. I'm also talking here about what goes into an application itself. As part of this, I am assuming that the person watching this is someone who is fundamentally competitive applicant to business school in the first place. So sometimes there is a misconception out there that it doesn't matter how weak a candidate is. It doesn't matter, they might have a negative 7,000 on the GMAT. They might have a GPA that's -7, whatever. They might have been unemployed for 10 years. They think, well, but as long as my application is strong, I'm going to get in. That's not true. If anyone tells you that it's true, they are perhaps not telling you the full truth. So I'm not going to go into what are the top 5 traits of a successful applicant. I have another session. I'm going to be redoing that session soon with GMAT Club. It's one of my most popular sessions. I am going to be revisiting it soon. I do have an idea of what are the 4 traits of a most successful applicant. I call it my ADCOM hierarchy of needs. Today, we are going to be talking about what I believe are the 5 traits of a successful application itself, by which I mean the things that you submit as part of the application. And those 5 things are: number 1, the application is accurate. Number 2, it is authentic. Number 3, it is consistent. Number 4, it is clear. And number 5, it is prioritized. So I know that you might be thinking like, okay, well, thanks a lot, Sherlock. Thanks, Einstein. I'm so glad I tuned into this. Like, your first tip is that I need to be accurate in my application. Like, like you're joking, right? Like that can't actually be a piece of advice. But inaccuracies can occur in 2 big ways. Now, number 1, they can occur unintentionally. And number 2, they can occur intentionally. And I'm going to cover both of those. And unintentional inaccuracies, let me tell you something. Every single year, I get an email, I don't know, 3 days after every major deadline with someone in a panic that says something like, oh my gosh, Maria, I was just reviewing the PDF of the application that I submitted and I noticed I had a really dumb mistake in it. And I never thought that I was going to be the person who made this error. just like with car accidents, where like the person, whenever people say like, oh, that other car came out of nowhere, I never saw them coming. Of course you didn't. If you would have seen it coming, you wouldn't have gotten into the accident in the first place. It's the same thing here. No one who ever makes a careless inaccuracy error in their application, no one ever thinks that they're going to be the person to do it. And yet people always do it. So I'm going to give you a few examples of what this is, just so that you can be on the lookout for yourself to make sure that you don't make some of these errors. You want to make sure that your dates are going to be accurate in terms of your dates of employment. Remember, if you don't already know this, I'm telling you now, or if you already know this, I'm reminding you. Remember that when you get accepted and then you decide to enroll in a school, that school is going to do a background check on you. That involves a third party that they hire is going to reach out to your company, to their HR department, and say things like, what was the hiring date of this person? What was their title? Blah, blah, blah. And so please just make sure that whatever date you put in the application form and on your resume, that they're the actual accurate dates. Similarly, with the salary, schools are very specific in the applications of what they do or do not want reported as salary. If you have, for example, stock options in a startup that are worth a certain amount of money in phantom dollars, do not put that money as salary. That's not salary, right? So things like that. Or if you have like a housing allowance as part of, you have an expat package or something like that, like, or you might even want to ask the school, like, okay, what should I put as salary? You do not want to overstate your salary, because again, it might then look really bad on you later. They might not know. Here's the thing. They might not know later that your unintentional mistake, they might think it was intentional. They might think that you were maybe trying to bump up the old salary so that you look a little more important to them, and it's not going to look good. So make sure that you read the instructions very carefully. One of the biggest places that this occurs from even the smartest, most 780 GMAT types, currencies. Currencies trip people up all the time. I once had someone email me and say, oh, I put in my resume, I was just rereading my resume, and I said that I had worked on this project that had an impact of $1 million. And it was actually Indian rupees, which is like 80, like it's more than 80 times less. Don't do that. Right? Because then it's really embarrassing. Like you can always reach out to a school if you do end up, by the way, finding yourself having made one of these, mistakes or minor kind of typos. You can always reach out to the school afterwards and just say like, look, I'm so embarrassed to say this, that I made this mistake and there's a typo. But why put yourself through that if you don't have to? And then another unintentional inaccuracy that I even see this again. This is not like only like you're like, oh, whatever, I'm never going to be the idiot who does this. Every year, someone will mention Stanford in their Harvard essay or vice versa, or Columbia in their Wharton essay or vice versa, or what have you. Things like this happen all the time. So what are you going to do to avoid this? Number one, I want you to start filling out that application form well in advance. Do not do it the day of the deadline. Start filling, because it's like all these little, in case you haven't experienced it yet, it's lots of teeny little boxes where it's like, okay, it's like a drop down, right? Of like the month and the date and the year, and the month and the year. And then, enter a solid, a full whole number. Wow, I have a cold. Enter the whole number value of your salary in US dollars. Like double check those things and put those in as early as you can. Do your resume. The resume is a major place where these things sneak in for even the smartest person. So just make sure that you factor in plenty of time to proofread prior to the admissions date. If you wait until the last second, that is when these things tend to creep in. Now, there are also sometimes intentional inaccuracies, and these are a little bit less comfortable to talk about. And I understand. Look, I get it. There's a lot of pressure here in this application process. You might look at some of these admissions numbers and think like, oh, well, it's a 10% admissions rate. Oh, it's so scary. I get it. And I also have come to learn over the years that I've been doing this, and also my own experiences working in various markets overseas before I went to business school, there are cultural differences, right? So what one culture might call a mild embellishment, another culture might call lying. When in doubt, I want you to think about the fact that in the US at least, the if we sort of think of it as like being like a little like maybe a scale, the scale does tend to tip more towards seeing it as lying and not as a harmless embellishment. So if you are on the fence and you're thinking to yourself, well, I could maybe overstate a little bit my contribution to this, or I could overstate the impact a little bit, no, if even if to you it might feel like kind of harmless, in the US culture at least, it does tend to be more seen as lying, and so try to scale that back a little bit. Now you might think, well, what's the harm of overstating it, Maria? Like, it's a victimless crime. But the thing is, like, actually the ultimate victim here might be you. Let's say that you put in your resume, and I'm going to make up an exaggerated example here, that, I invented the iPhone. I was it. People think Steve Jobs did it. They're wrong. It was me. I invented it. And now it's $1 zillion product. All me. Okay, so what's the harm? I get into business school. Cool. The problem is that if the school later on discovers that you lied about something in your application, that is grounds to revoke the offer of admission if they find out before you enroll. It is grounds to kick you out of school if you've already enrolled, or it's even grounds to revoke your degree after you've graduated. So if you intentionally make one of these, if you go beyond sort of a harmless embellishment, if you actually like really overstate what you did, or like kind of like, oh well, I didn't actually lead that project, or it really wasn't my idea, but if they find out, like, you're not, it's not like, oh, whew, I enrolled, I'm here, I moved into the dorms today, I got away with it, nice. Like, no, at any point they might find out that happened, and at that point, that could be pretty disastrous for you. It's actually worse, I think, to get into a school, you quit your job, you say, sayonara, boss, I'm off to business school, you move to a new city, and then they're like, oh, sorry, actually, you can't enroll. I think it's actually, I would rather that you not get accepted to a school than you get accepted and then have to backtrack. It's very similar. I use a lot of dating analogies. It's similar to this concept of catfishing in online dating. Like, if somebody says, like, if I were to say, like, yes, I am a 6.5 foot tall Swedish volleyball player, mezzo soprano in the Metropolitan Opera, like, none of those things is true. Eventually the truth is going to come out, and it's not sustainable in the long term. So someone might like click on the profile and be like, oh yes, this sounds like a profile of someone I would like to go on a date on. But then you actually show up and you're not that person. It's not sustainable in the long term. So please avoid the temptation. At least in dating, you might get a second chance to go on other dates with other people, but with an MBA, you really don't get a second chance. And so here's the part where people say, like, I don't know, Maria, I don't feel comfortable with this like whole being fully entirely honest thing, because if I say that, like, maybe I failed at something, or I made a mistake, or I've got this weakness, and or I did contribute a lot to this project, but I really wasn't the person involved. Another one, for example, that just occurred to me, that's also in the application form itself, is they will often ask you, what is the number of direct reports you have? That literally means in the organization chart of your company, do you have people reporting to you? It doesn't mean, are you senior to someone on the team and there's someone else junior to you and you sometimes guide them or tell them what to do? That's not the same thing as a direct report. So don't say that you have 3 direct reports if you actually have 0. It's okay. It's not going to risk your chances if you're honest. Because why? Number one, a lot of these admissions readers have been doing this for years. And they have developed a really strong intuition of what's realistic and what's not, right? So if you work at, especially if you work at a large company that tends to send lots of people to business school, they're going to say, like, well, wait a minute, that's weird. Like, normally when someone is only at the associate level at this bank, like, they might have 2 junior analysts under them, but not 12. So they're going to have their own kind of intuition sensor, their kind of little detector there. And by the way, admitting failures or mistakes or errors that you made, it can actually be a good thing for you to demonstrate, because it can demonstrate to schools that, number one, you have a growth mindset, and number two, that you're mature. There is no such thing as a perfect leader out there. There's no such thing as a business person who's never made a mistake. The important thing is not that we never make mistakes, because we're all going to make mistakes. The important thing is that we try to grow and learn from those mistakes. So actually, the growth mindset, demonstrating that, is actually something that schools like to see. So don't pretend that you're perfect. And besides, like, you might have demonstrated, you don't have to be the person in charge. You don't have to be the person who invented the iPhone. You can still get into a terrific school based on the personality traits and the skills and the sort of person that you've demonstrated that you are through lots of other ways. So there have been times, I think part of the reason why I'm going on this kind of thing is that I've been in situations where I do a mock interview for someone for the Harvard Business School interview, and my detector, my BS detector is fairly well honed at this point, I like to think. And so I'll zoom in on something. I'll be like, you said in your resume that you did this thing, and it just doesn't make sense. And so I'll probe and probe and probe, and then afterwards they'll be like, well, and actually I didn't do it, or actually, yeah, I did kind of like lie about it, frankly, just to put it bluntly. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, like, you have doomed yourself. And the sad thing is, a lot of times when people exaggerate, they would have gotten in anyway. I have one heartbreaking example that of like someone who like told such an outrageous lie. Essentially, they didn't say they invented the iPhone, but it was pretty bad. And I was like, why? Like, you are such a strong candidate. You didn't have to tell the lie. So, in case you have any other reason to doubt me or to be like, I don't know if I like this advice from Maria, they can always contact your recommender. So if you say in your essay, well, I invented the iPhone and I'm amazing, if they call your boss, because they're going to have your boss's contact information, because when you write your recommendation, they fill out the recommender contact info. So when they contact your recommender, they can say like, hey, did this person actually invent the iPhone? And if your boss is like, what? No way. Then it's game over for you. So hopefully that will help. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to help you realize that, like, it's okay. You don't have to be perfect. And in fact, if you present yourself as being too perfect, it might set off alarm bells. So my next word is authentic. And you might be like, well, authentic and accuracy, like, those are the same words, Maria. But I have a little bit of a subtlety here. So for me, accuracy is about the substance of what you portray, and authenticity is more about the style. So I think that it's really important that you realize that in the application, particularly in the essays, right, which tend to be more of a narrative, that is to say, a story written on paper, it's very important that you have your authentic voice come through in that essay. So some of the most common mistakes here that I see, people will say, well, I'm applying to school. It's a university, so I need to sound learned and academic. And so sometimes I'll see lines and essays that look something like this. Irrespective of context, I perpetually endeavor to optimize synergies of multifaceted interpersonal dynamics. Okay. So, first of all, the MBA is actually not a purely academic degree in like the PhD sense. Like, it's not one where you're not getting judged on your writing within the MBA. And even if it were an academic degree, it's not an English degree. It's not a composition degree. You're not going to be judged on how big your vocabulary is. Second of all, stuff like this is really boring to read. Um, it's either boring, or it's hard to understand, or it kind of, look, let's just be honest. The sentence above, do you kind of want to, let's say you were stuck in an airport, there's a flight delay and you're stuck in an airport, and the person who wrote the sentence above is sitting next to you for 6 hours. Does this sound like someone that you want to hang out with? It doesn't. And why is this important? Because business schools are not just, they're looking for people who are likable, because they want people who are going to come to their campus communities and make friends and support their classmates and join the club and be in the musical and be like this kind of a nice person. And so if you portray yourself as like, hello, I am a thesaurus that has come to life, like, I don't know, like, it's just, it actually risks backfiring so spectacularly, even though I know it comes from a good place. Like, the intuition to try to do this, it comes from a good place. It is the wrong intuition. You need to squash it like a little bug. And then third of all, Sometimes when people are like, I have to use really big words in my academic university application, I have to use university sounding words. Sometimes people misuse the big words, and that's even worse. The only thing that's worse than some boring, unlikable academic sounding text is one in which the words are not used correctly. So, for example, a much nicer way to write the above in a way that's a little bit more likable and also, kind of like clearer to understand. From Argentina to India, from Chile to China, I've found that lunch is the best way to connect with coworkers around the world. Notice how the second example is saying pretty much the same thing as the first one, right? It's talking about different contexts that the person has worked in, um, multifaceted interpersonal dynamics, aka lunch. How do you optimize these interpersonal dynamics? You have lunch with them. So whenever you have an option between choosing gee, do I need to pretend to sound like somebody else? No, don't. Try to write your essay in much the same way as if though you were speaking to someone. Within reason, of course. I mean, if you normally lace your language with an expletive every 2 seconds, like, okay, you're not going to do that. But you want your essays in particular to sound like you are talking. And here you might be like, well, how are they going to know, Maria? Like, maybe I actually am someone who optimizes synergies of complex interpersonal dynamics. Okay. Well, first of all, there's a lot of different ways that they can know that you're being authentic or not in terms of your voice. If you happen to submit a standardized test that has a writing sample, like the GRE, and if you submit your scores, they have the right in the admissions office, if they want to pull up that essay that you wrote. And if the essay is written and it's way different than in the test, then it's way different from the essay that you submit in your application. That's going to be a not a great outcome, because it's going to seem like, wait a minute, who is this person really, like, are they pretending to be someone fake in their essay in the application? Also, video interviews. So, in case you haven't yet started delving into the magical world of MBA applications, a lot of schools have increasingly started adding to the application itself these automated video interviews. And they tend to be something like, you will be given a question like, talk about a time you had a difficult teammate. And then you get, let's say, 30 seconds to think of what your answer is. And then you get 90 seconds to give your answer. And you only get one take each time. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe one school was doing them, if at all. 5 years ago, they weren't that common. Now, more and more and more and more and more schools are doing it because of ChatGPT. I predict that in a ChatGPT world, more and more schools are either considering using video interviews or are accelerating the timeline at which they're planning on using video interviews. As a side note about ChatGPT, while we're here, um, the schools have often already been using anti-plagiarism checkers to make sure that you're not just like copying an essay you found on the internet, or you're not just using like your friend's essay from 3 years ago. So the anti-plagiarism checkers, excuse me, are increasingly incorporating tools that are like, generative AI. Like, does this text sound like it was written by generative AI? So, first of all, it's like you might get away with it, but you might not get away with it. I do think that these automated AI tools can be useful for things like, once you've already gotten to what is essentially your final draft, if you want to run it past something to check on like spelling and grammar and things like that. Sure. I also think, though, that existing word processing tools kind of already do a perfectly fine job of that. But don't use generative AI at all to write the whole thing. And then they're also, by the way, if a school doesn't have video interviews, they're also going to have the actual interview. So it's like, you can't just get into business school and at no point, like, no one will ever talk to me or hear my actual voice or how I speak or the sorts of words that I use or, how do I describe things. They are going to get to know the real you at some point. So by the way, like, I want this to be something that is actually a relief for many of you. It's okay if you are not a native English speaker, or if you are a native English speaker, but writing is just not your thing, and it never has been. Don't worry. Like, don't panic and think like, oh no, this is the thing that's going to doom me. Don't. It's because if that's who you really are, and if that's how you sound when you talk, it's actually a good thing because all of those different pieces are going to fit together, right? The real you, the real way you speak, the real way you present yourself and express your ideas, and who you are in writing on the application. So moving on to my next point, there needs to be some consistency. In fact, there needs to be a lot of consistency. So, excuse me. Uh, you might have seen this cool little diagram. Well, I don't know if it's cool. You're like, it's not that cool, Maria. Okay, fine. If my kid were here, he'd be like, Mom, you're so lame. It's totally not cool. But I made this little diagram years ago in PowerPoint to sort of show here are all of the different parts of the MBA application, right? And they're not just sort of existing like in a vacuum by themselves, like each little piece floating off in its own little bubble in space. They actually all connect together like the gears in a very sophisticated machine. And in fact, the gears of that machine, those gears all need to work together going in the same direction. Because if one part of the machine is going in one direction and then there's a gear over here in the machine that's going in a different direction, you don't have to be a mechanical engineer to know that if the gears are going in different directions, everything comes screeching to a halt and it is not great. So you're going to want to make sure that everything in your application, all of those little gears are turning in the same direction to provide a consistent view of who you are. So where are some places where this lack of consistency might actually show up? Well, here's some of the main areas of contradiction or gear gumming that I tend to see. Number one, the career vision that you present versus your actual career to date. So if you want to work in a certain career, you're like, I want to go to get the MBA because I want to go work in something that is way over here and it's a very specialized field and I have absolutely no experience in it whatsoever. Those two things are gonna come screeching to a halt. Now, how you can try to mitigate this? A couple of ways. Number one, think about any transferable skills that you've already gotten that then you can apply to that future field. And ideally, do what I like to call an applicant lab career vision homework. Find other people who have used the MBA to make a similar switch from what you are doing now to what you want to be doing in the future. And then if you talk to them, you can mention those people in the application. You can say, well, actually, I've spoken to 3 other people who used to be Teach for America teachers who now work at Apple and doing product development in their education group, for example. So just realize that if there's any point where there's going to be friction between those gears, the onus is on you to figure out ways to maybe put a little bit of WD-40 in those gears to make sure that they, or some oil in the gears. I don't know what WD-40, if that's a global brand, probably isn't, but some sort of lubricant within the gears so that they don't, it's on you though to try to put those different pieces together in a way where it doesn't jam up together. And another place where things can really contradict why our school versus the career vision. So you might make an amazing argument for like, I need an MBA and here's what I'm going to do with the MBA, and here's where my career is going to go. And I need a school that has a super, super strong sustainability and environmental, focus because I want to work in sustainability in the long term. And then womp womp, the school doesn't really have a sustainability focus, or they might have like one class, but the class was canceled last year and the professor actually left 3 months ago. Like, wow. So you're going to want to match whatever your career vision is to the specific school that you're applying to. Please be careful that you don't make a really terrific argument as to why you should be accepted to some other school. Another place is the leadership outcomes described in the resume, the way versus the way that the actions are described in the essay. So let's say in the resume, it says something like, and I'm just going to stick with this hyperbolized, exaggerated example. Let's say the resume says, I invented the iPhone. Great. And then let's say that in that same application, there's an essay that talks about, tell us about your greatest leadership accomplishment. And you're like, well, I was a member of the iPhone launch team and I as part of that, I organized the weekly meetings and I sent out the meeting reminder and I took notes at the meeting and I ordered the coffee and the lunches for the meetings. And that was my contribution. Like, wait, I'm sorry, wait, what? But in your resume, the resume, it said, it kind of made it sound in the resume like you were like, woo, doing all this cool stuff. But then when I asked for details in the essay, like you don't really have as much stuff to talk about. So again, it's fine. You don't have to have been the person who invented the iPhone. You don't have to be the person. If you were already like Fortune 500 CEO material at the age of 26, you would not need an MBA. Honestly, if you really are that, then don't bother with an MBA. Save yourself the time and the money. So just make sure that that you're balancing out. If you're talking about I did X and Y in a very abbreviated way in the resume, that then when you talk about, if you talk about that same example in the essay, that it matches. It's not like, wait, are these two different people here? Are these two different people on the same team? And then also the personality traits in the essays versus what your recommenders say about you. So almost all schools require at least one recommendation. Most require two recommendations. At no point, by the way, should you ever say anything in your essays like, I am X. Like, I am a great team member. I am very supportive. It's much better for you to tell me a story where you show me that you're someone who's very supportive, right? So BTW, just sort of a little note there. Like, don't just say like, I am someone who is, it's like if I were to say like, I am someone who is a 6 foot tall Swedish volleyball player. And it's like, well, okay, you have to prove it to me that you actually know, like, oh, well, here's a volleyball. And I'm like, oh, I don't know what to do with this. Oh gosh, it fell on the floor. Like you're going to have to make sure that when you talk about the personality traits in your essays, when you talk about who you are, don't forget that your recommender is also going to they have a whole grid. The recommendations, they got 2 sort of paragraphs that they're going to write about you, about your strengths, and about a time that they gave you critical feedback, aka a weakness that you've had to overcome. And then there's a grid. There's a whole grid where it's like different personality traits, like, are they a good communicator? Is this person an innovative person? Is this someone who is good at commanding executive presence or whatever it is? And so if you say like, one thing I am is I'm like so innovative, you guys. I'm like the most innovative person ever. And then if your recommender puts like on the innovation thing in the recommendation, like, well, I don't know, maybe, top 50%, but not like top 1%. Ooh, yikes. So how are you going to try to avoid this from happening? So for the recommendation, first of all, I want you to not just say to your recommender, like, okay, can you recommend me for business school? Okay, cool, thanks. Here's the link, bye. I actually want you to provide them with a document, and I want you to meet with them and actually say like, hey, I'm applying, like, let's get on the same page about like what you might want to write. Here's what I was thinking you might want to say about me, or also like, here's how I'm presenting myself. How does that sound to you? Right? Like, does that sound right to you? Does that sound like who the me that you know? Or more importantly, the me that you're going to write about? If so, then great. Then you can proceed as planned. But otherwise, if you say to your recommender, I'm really, for this one school, I really want to focus on how innovative I was. And your recommender kind of goes like, innovative? I mean, look, don't get me wrong. I think you're great. I love having you on my team, but innovative? Ooh, that's a pretty good sign to you that maybe that's not the personality trait or the strength about yourself that you should focus on, because again, like, their gear is going to be twisting in one direction and your gear is going to be twisting in another direction, and whoop, it's not going to be great. And then moving on to my 5th thing, clear. So admissions readers might not have a background in what you do. Most people who work in admissions, many of them have either been in admissions kind of like as for several years. Maybe they graduated from the school that you're applying to. Very frequently, they used to work in recruiting at investment banks or recruiting at consulting firms, for example. So they have HR backgrounds. And so at any moment, you do not want there to be this kind of like record scratch moment while they're reading your application. And here I am totally dating myself, but hopefully if you're watching this, you are at least somewhat familiar with the concept of a record. It was a thing that people used to use to listen to music, and it had a little needle that would that would vibrate and would interpret the sound. And if you suddenly quickly ripped off that needle from the record, there'd be like this like screech kind of thing, and the music would abruptly stop, right? So it'd be music, 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 screech, and then silence. That moment is the moment I do not want any admissions reader to have when they are reading your application. So anything in your application that is not clear or very simple for them to understand, that takes up a lot of that mental energy or that cognitive energy, is a moment you want to avoid. So, what are some of the key ways that you can avoid this? Or conversely, what are some of the key ways I see people make this mistake? Um, excuse me. You don't want to get way into the weeds of very specific details that are very specific to you and your life and your day-to-day job. So, for example, what I refer to often as the technical details. And by technical, to be clear, I don't just mean this doesn't just apply to people who have technical jobs. The technical details are the details that are very specific to how you execute your day-to-day job. So, for example, let's say you build dashboards in Tableau, or you're building Monte Carlo simulations in Excel, or things like that. Like, some of those details are just not that not that necessary. And definitely, if you do have a truly technical job, don't start talking about like very specific. I wrote Python code that did blah blah blah. Like, be careful with anything that is jargony at all. Um, but it's not just about the jargon related to your job. Your industry probably also has a lot of jargon that an external person might not know. And why am I even bringing these things up? Because when we have a job that we do, we live and breathe it, maybe not 24/7. I hope it's not 24/7. That's not very healthy. But we live and breathe it for a significant amount of the time that we're awake. And so a lot of terms that to us are just like obviously second nature, just keep in mind that they might not be second nature to someone who doesn't live in your world. So, for example, before I launched Applicant Lab, in a previous version of my life, I worked in the entertainment industry, and in the movie industry in particular, there's a term called P&A. Like, oh yeah, what was the P&A budget? Now, for anyone who's worked in movies, you immediately know, boom, P&A. That's basically the marketing budget, right? All the billboards that you see for a movie, and the TV ads, and the ads in the websites, all of that is P&A. But someone who doesn't, if you write in your resume and your business school application, I was managing a $10 million P&A budget. P&A, like potatoes and apples, like what does that mean? So use simple words like marketing. Everyone understands marketing. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying you can never use like any terminology whatsoever. Like, obviously, the very, very heavy feeder industries into business schools, specifically the business ones like consulting or banking, yes, of course, you can use something like DCF for discounted cash flow, or BI for business intelligence, right? So I'm not saying like you can't use any acronyms ever, but for the most part, just be aware of the fact that the person reading your materials does not come from your world. Another thing that might be specific to you that's very intuitive for you, but that is not intuitive for the reader, is something that might be very specific to your country or the region of the world that you come from. So, for example, I remember when I was working in India. This was over 20 years ago when I first got there, and I was building a financial model, and one of my colleagues was like, "Okay, so that's probably going to be about, I don't know, maybe 7 crore a year." And I was like, "I'm sorry, what?" I'm sorry, I think there's something in my ears. Did you crore? Crore? What's a crore? And for those of you who might be asking yourself, what is a crore? A crore is a unit of currency. It's kind of like, how like when you say, at least here in the US, we will say a ton refers to 2,000 pounds. It's like a crore refers to, I don't even remember right now if it's like 100 million or, oh gosh. Anyway, the point is it refers to like a chunk of Indian rupees. For someone living in India, a crore or a lakh, immediately obvious. Another example is if somebody mentions, say, a government organization where they like, someone is living in Germany and they helped convince the government to do something with, I don't know, AI legislation or whatever, and they'll just mention like, oh, the blah blah blah, the government body that if you live in Germany, everyone knows that that's the name of the governmental body, but not if you're sitting in the US. So think about either for something like currencies, either put it in USD, or if the school is based, say, in the EU, then maybe put it in euros. If they're based in the UK, try to translate it into pounds, because they're not going to have, you don't want them to spend the mental energy trying to make those translations in their head. And similarly, if there's anything like, you know, like, oh, I'm referencing a local government body, or I'm referencing, my let's say, here's another example. Let's say you work for a startup that partnered with a very big established firm in your home country. I might not know, if I'm sitting in another country and I'm an admissions reader, I might not know that you partnered with that company you partnered with, that was a huge coup. So don't say like, oh, we partnered with, I don't know, Flipkart. Instead say, we partnered with the number one e-commerce business in my country. Something like that, as an example. That is not an accurate example. Please do not say, oh, Flipkart's not, I don't, yeah, I'm just making these up on the fly. And also, I'm still pretty sick. So thank you in advance for your patience. The point is, this is one of those things again, and I think this is the case with a lot of things I've said here, where when I say to someone like, just remember that the person reading this doesn't come from your world, everyone's like, yeah, Maria, totally get it. And then, but it still sneaks in. It sneaks in with things like, you mentioned a partner, or you mentioned, like, let's say a VC firm, right? You work for a startup that got the biggest, shiniest, most exciting VC firm in your country to invest in you. Someone sitting on the other side of the world might not know that that VC firm is as elite as it is, right? So providing those sorts of contexts, instead of saying like, here's the name of the VC firm, say the second largest VC firm in my country, as opposed to the name of the VC firm, which I may or may not know. And then finally, prioritized. So here, this is the logo of AGAC, the Association of International Graduate Admissions Consultants. You can find out more about us at agac.org. So why am I bringing up AGAC out of well, I'll tell you in a second, but just as a side note, like, we live in a day and age where, like, literally anyone can build a little website and say that they're an admissions consultant. They may or may not actually know a lot about admissions consulting, but if you are looking for an admissions consultant, I really advise that you go to agac.org and you find someone who is AGAC certified, right? These are folks who are, and I am a member of AGAC. So full disclosure, I'm a little biased, totally biased, but I strongly advise that you go to AGAC and try to find a consultant on AGAC, because it's for admissions consultants who have a certain amount of expertise, a certain amount of, who we all agree to follow a certain code of ethics, et cetera, et cetera. And why is it also relevant? Like, why is she mentioning AGAC? That's weird. This is not a commercial for AGAC. Part of what's cool about being a member of AGAC is that we, as respected admissions consultants, the schools will invite us to their campuses. The admissions offices will invite us to their campuses, and or they will also attend an annual conference that we do, where we kind of like share, like, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? What are trends that you're seeing? Blah, blah, blah. It's super fun and it's great. And it's a chance to actually get to talk to admissions officers in a way that if we weren't in AGAC, we might not get. So one of the things that I have learned as being a member of AGAC that I did not know prior to being in AGAC is that most admissions readers can read easily. Pardon me. Sorry. I was holding out as long as I could on the Kleenex, and then finally I reached a point where I was like, oh, I need to use it. Okay. Most admissions readers can be reading 50 applications or more in a day. The entire application, 50 applications in a day. So this is if you've seen my resume webinar elsewhere on the GMAT Club YouTube channel, I love this picture. I use it a lot. This is what it feels like to work in admissions. So why does prioritization matter? Because if someone's reading 50 applications in a workday, they're not going to have the time to like lovingly and meticulously dig through all the details of everything you've written and try to glean from it those subtle points that you're trying to make, those little breadcrumbs that you're leaving for them, that you're winking at them. They don't have time for that. Uh, this is not a place for subtlety. You're not going to get an hour of their time. You're probably going to get between 5 to 10 minutes on that first read through. And if you're new to the whole world of admissions, how most schools do it is that most schools will have two separate independent readers do a first read through of every application. That is a 5 to 10 minute process. If both readers agree on next steps, then it's done. So if both readers say, yes, let's proceed with this person to the interview stage, great. And if both readers say, ooh, this person is not qualified or not what we're looking for, then you're not. And then if one says yes and one says no, one says yes and one says no, then it goes to someone else on the team who is like the ultimate, someone usually higher up on the team who will say like, okay, yes or no in terms of moving forward. So, that means you get two shots. There's two different people that you've got about 5 minutes to win over in your application. And so you might be like, well, but you just talked about clarity. So just to be clear, why is prioritization different from clarity? Clarity is about asking yourself, okay, is what I'm talking about here easy for someone who is not from my world to understand? World broadly defined, industry, job, region, whatever it is that you do that defines your world. Can someone who's not from that world understand what I'm talking about? Prioritization, on the contrary, is more like, am I focusing on the things that they most want to know about me in those 5 to 10 minutes that they're going to spend on my application? So you might have also seen this if you've seen my resume webinar. So just to be clear, so what does that mean? Like, what should I be prioritizing, Maria? Well, okay. When you're applying to business school, an admissions reader is not necessarily like, yes, they are thinking about who you're going to be in a year or two, because they do want to keep in mind, like, okay, the person I admit to my class today is the person that I'm going to be putting in front of my corporate recruiters a year from now, right? When those banks and consulting firms and tech firms, when they come to my campus to recruit my talent, I need to make sure that this is talent that those recruiters want to see. So they are thinking about you in the short term, but far more importantly, they are trying to think about who you are going to be in the longer term. Let's say in 20 years. They are looking for leadership skills that help show that in 20, 10, 20, 30 years, you're going to be an alumnus or alumna who goes on to make the school proud. That makes them say, like, you know what, I'm so glad we let this person in, because now this person is a well-respected person in whatever it is they're doing. Could be the business world, could be nonprofits, could be all sorts of things. But at least then, whenever they're written about in the press, and it mentions such and such person, a graduate of the Michigan Ross School of Business, now Ross looks good as a result. So the schools, they're sort of, they definitely want to know if you're the sort of person that the corporate recruiters are interested in. But even more importantly, they want to make sure that in 20 years, you're going to have those leadership skills that are going to help you elevate to those positions of influence. And what matters more is those interpersonal leadership skills, and not so much your technical skills, your IQ skills, being smart, being a good coder, being great at building financial spreadsheets and models, and the sorts of things that might be successful, might make you successful in your job today, but that you're not going to need to know in 20 years. So what are some examples of things to prioritize? Um, excuse me again. I'm trying so hard not to cough, you guys. Okay. Okay, conveying results. Quantifiable results if possible. I know that quantifiable results are not always possible. I get it. Don't stress. But you want to convey some sort of results. What was something that was different or better or improved because you were there? Like, what happened? Right? So simply saying something like, I was a member of a team that contributed to a strategic analysis report. Okay, so what happened? So what? Like, what was the result of that report? I'm far more interested in, like, what was the result of that report? Because some people might work on a strategic analysis report that transforms their company, and the company uses that report and completely pivots from being a B2C company to being a B2B company. And then they get acquired by Salesforce, and that's a huge success. But someone else might work on a strategic analysis report that someone says, oh, okay, thanks, boom, and then they put it on a shelf and they never read it again. If you don't tell me what the results were of the things that you've worked on, I'm not going to know how impactful you've been in your career. So if you have been impactful, please convey that impact through results whenever you can. I also want you to prioritize, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, EQ, not IQ, right? Those interpersonal skills that leaders are going to need, not so much look at how smart I am or look at how good I am at some sort of technical skill that I need now, but I'm not going to need in 20 years. And a way to do this, especially in your essays, is to focus on first-person actions in your writing. This helps me picture what you did. I see a lot of we's in essays, right? I like to joke like wee all the way home, right? Like the story of the three little pigs. No. Yeah, I'm actually excited that my son's not here right now. He's still at school. I'm so glad because otherwise he would be like, "Oh, you're so lame." But we all the way home. That's great. We are not applying to business school. Your team is not applying to business school. So we as a team went to the client and we came up with a solution and we made the client really happy. Cool. But you're not trying to sell me. I think one way to put it is that I find myself saying this a lot. You're not trying to sell me in your business school application on how good your company is or how good your team is. I'm not going to hire your consulting company as an admission if I'm an admissions reader, right? I'm not going to hire your consulting company to come and be my consulting company. I'm hiring you as an individual, quote unquote, hiring you to come and be a member of my class who's going to be a positive addition to my classroom and campus community while you're here, and who's going to make the campus proud in the longer term via your career success. And the best way for me to gauge whether or not you're the kind of person who has the potential to do these things is if I know what you specifically did. So be on the lookout in your writing. If in your essay the majority of the verbs are preceded by we did, we said, we thought, we presented, that's a red flag in your own writing that you're not being specific enough. And that's you're not prioritizing your own actions enough. So this is especially important when you're cutting for space. So in that first draft of the essay, for example, right away, I mean right away, WRITE, away, as in write as much as you can, not right away as in immediately. So just write as much as you can. And then you're going to cut. And while you're cutting, think about some of these three things to prioritize, leave these things in, and then all the other stuff is ripe for being cut. So those are my 5 top elements of what make an application successful. Once again, applicantlab.com. I just wanted to reiterate that it is the best way. If you like my advice and you like the way I break things down, et cetera, applicantlab.com is the best way to work with me, albeit indirectly. It is affordable. It is available 24/7. And it's a lot of videos of me and exercises that I've created to help you follow some of these steps and make sure that you don't fall into the many pitfalls that I have discussed today. So that endeth my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing. I now need to come over here. Oh, here I am. Oh, look, it's me. Oh, wait, my camera's been down. Okay. If you'll just excuse me for 1 second, I'm going to mute myself because I need to take a sip of water. Excuse me. But then I think I have a few minutes to do, if there are any questions, I can try to handle or address some of those, but give me just a moment, please. Actually, I'm going to stop. All right, I am back with a little bit less frog in my throat. All right, so are there questions? Let me hop on over here to the old chat room, chat box. Okay, so how can is there a way for me to pull up the chat question on the thing? I'm just going to read the question out loud, and I'm just going to go in order. So KP Agrawal asks, thank you so much, GMAT Club Genies. Magic. Okay, is there a specific format to check the authenticity of personal essay responses to essay prompt established by US business schools? Okay, I need to think about what this question is asking. Is there a specific format to check the authenticity? I'm not sure. Is there a specific format to check the authenticity of personal essay responses? I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, KP. I do apologize. So, if you're asking about the how do they check the authenticity, um, they will they will contact your recommender during the admissions process. If they do think that there's something in there that's like, "Woo, kinda weird," they will contact your recommender or they will contact your employer or a previous employer. So if you say like, "Oh, at my last company, I invented the iPhone." Like, I haven't invented the iPhone now, but I did in my last company, then they can reach out to, like, the HR department, for example, and say like, "Hey, did this person actually, can you connect me with someone?" But the way how this normally happens in terms of authenticity, um, aside from contacting a recommender, will be after you get accepted, they will do a formal background check, and they contract with, I think it's like two big firms that they tend to contract with, that actually, like, this is all the firms do. Like, the companies, they are trained to look up, they will reach out to things like registrars of your university, to verify that your grades are accurate. They will reach out to previous employers to verify dates of employment, salary levels, things like that. So I'm not sure if that was your question, but if that was your question, like, how do they verify if you're being authentic? That's my answer. Okie dokie. So the next question I see, Ragav Chowdhury. What's a fine line between writing what's authentic to you and what would present you the best to the adcoms? So this is a fine line, and it's good that you're noticing that it is. I think, and I do have sort of some stuff about this in Applicant Lab. I think probably the best way I could summarize this advice is to say, think about again the fact that they are looking for, like, okay, who today is going to has demonstrated the sorts of, traits and personality uh things that 20 years from now is going to make them sort of a successful business leader, right? And so if we think about things like maturity and humility, um, if you use, I think, maturity and humility as your two guiding factors without veering too far, because it is possible to go too far in the other direction where you're like, I stink. Everything I touch turns to lead. Every project I'm on fails. Like, no, no, no. You don't have to go that far. So if that was your question between, like, you want to be authentic and, like, look, if you mess something up, or if you could, like, oh man, I wish I could do this better again in the future. I have sort of specific uh, ways in Applicant Lab that I teach for, like, here's how, I've got this technique on how to address things like that. But if you sort of use as your guiding star, like, what they're looking for is someone who 20 years from now is going to make the school proud, and who isn't going to, like, I don't know, throw a temper tantrum in public, and then everyone's going to be like, ooh. Or here's a very exaggerated example, someone who maybe might not have, like, the strongest of ethics, like Sam Bankman-Fried right now, right? Like, with the FTX collapse, you know I at least as far as I know, like, most people now associate him with Stanford, even though, like, I don't think he went to Stanford, but his parents teach at Stanford and he donated a lot of money to Stanford. And so now, like, now people are like, oh, Stanford kind of is, and it's a little bit tarnished because it's like, oh, this guy was a scammer. And so the schools don't want ever to be, like, in the same news article with someone who goes to jail or scams others or goes viral for screaming at an employee, at, some video that gets linked to, uploaded to some TikTok, like, nightmare bosses, like, so think about that when you're presenting, your side of things, or walking that fine line between, humility and maturity. Okay. Someone's asking, how much is the Applicant Lab service? What's your success rate? So the Applicant Lab service costs, the retail cost is $349, but again, with the highly creative discount code, GMAT Club 10, you could get 10% off. So it's $315, which is far less than what you would otherwise pay for even 1 hour of my time. In terms of success rate, Emmanuel, that's a great question. I can understand why you're asking it. I do not track success rate, and here is why. When other admissions consultants track success rates, it is often a function of the inputs just as much as it is of the outputs. And what do I mean by that? I mean, and you can judge this for yourself, test it out for yourself. I have had so many people come to me and say, I went to an admissions consultant and I said, I want to apply to Stanford. And they said, we won't work with you on Stanford. Why don't you instead apply to, I don't know, some other school that's like ranked 25th or 30th? So frequently, not always, but usually, if a consulting firm says we have a 90% acceptance rate or a success rate, that number is usually highly massaged. I made a decision when I launched Applicant Lab, and I might revisit this one day, honestly, that I would never turn anyone away. I would never say to someone, I mean, look, if someone asks me, like, look, do you think I'm getting into Harvard? And I think the answer is no, I will tell them, like, look, I don't think it's going to happen for you. But I'm not going to prevent them from using Applicant Lab. I don't stop anyone. And so if I were doing a traditional admissions consulting firm, I would call it, wink, wink, a free consultation. Very clever. The free consultation is one where I will try to ascertain how coachable this client is. And if I don't think this client has a chance of getting into like an M7 school, and if I say, okay, I do think they have a chance of getting into a school with an 80% acceptance rate. And if I say, hey, I'm not going to work with you on these higher schools, but I'm going to work with you on the lower, and if that person says like, oh, no way, it's Stanford or bust, then as an admissions consulting company, I might not follow up with that client. I might not want them to sign up with me. So just as a heads up, I do not track a success rate, because if I were to start tracking that as something that I would use in my marketing, then I would start to get real, I would become a real gatekeeper in terms of who I would only let people that I know are definitely getting into schools, and I would tell everyone to only apply to schools that have like 100% acceptance rates. So just a heads up, that was sort of a consumer education part for you, like buyer beware. I'm not saying that the other firms don't provide value. They do provide value. They can, not always, but many of them can provide a lot of value, but just be wary of like that accepted, like the 90% success rates, because they are manufactured metrics. Okay, moving on. Do you have any advice for applicants ages 38 to 40 who are looking at full-time MBA programs for a career pivot? Are there any schools that are more open to older candidates? So I do honestly think that ages 38 to 40 is going to be a lot harder for a typical 2-year full-time MBA. Now, that assumes that by 38 to 40, that means that you have, let's say, almost 20-ish, between 15 to 20 years of work experience. Sometimes people are age 38 but they got a PhD. They spent, 8 years in a PhD program. And so they really only have like 7 years of full-time work experience. In that case, you will be judged based on like the number of years of work experience that you have and not so much your chronological age. But let's assume that you've got 15 to 20-ish years of work experience. It's going to be hard to get into a full-time MBA program for a career pivot, because it's going to be hard to make a career pivot at the full-time as a result of the full-time MBA. Because if we think about the sorts of companies that come to recruit on the campus, they are coming looking for a specific type of person. I'm not saying that it's not possible, but it's very difficult. I actually recently, I caught this terrible cold on a flight back from Boston after Thanksgiving. But while I was in Boston, I actually I went to the HBS campus, because a good, very dear friend of ours, the best man at our wedding, is actually a professor at HBS today. And I met up with some former Applicant Lab clients who were students there. And one of them was 8 years, not 18 years, but 8 years, excuse me, out of college. And this person was saying like, look, it's been a lot harder than I thought to get a job. Not impossible, but certainly there's no such thing as an MBA program. I like to quip, it's Harvard, not Hogwarts. It's not magic. There's no MBA program that's going to let you just like erase what you've done so far. Your best bet, if you are age 38 to 40, is you could look to a 1-year MBA program. This would be something perhaps like, say, the Sloan Fellows program or the Stanford MSX program. And then once you're in that program, you hustle like the wind. You get an unpaid internship in whatever it is that you want to do. In fact, right now, try to find in whatever field it is you think you want to switch to, can you find some sort of like volunteer, let's say you want to switch into ed tech. You don't work in education technology now, but you want to work can you find like an ed tech startup that you can devote 5 hours a week to? Just so that way you start like establishing some knowledge and some credibility in that future space. Honestly, what I would say to you is if 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 I were 38 to 40 and I were looking to pivot careers, I would look to do a part-time MBA, understanding that the part-time MBA is not designed for career pivots, but it is possible for the right person who hustles. The program is what you make of it. So if you go into the MBA program, let's say, one of the nice things about being a student is that people are a lot more likely to want to talk to you versus if you're a job hunter. So if you reach out to someone and you say, I'm looking for a job in whatever it is that you do, can you talk to me? It's kind of like an eye roll moment, like, ugh. But if you say, well, I'm a student at an MBA program and I'm studying ed tech. I want to do a project on ed tech as part of my MBA. Can you talk to me? People are more likely to want to help students. So even if you become a student in a part-time capacity, that can actually help open doors to giving you an excuse to reach out to people who work in a certain field. It gives you an excuse to reach out to people at certain companies. It gives you an excuse to work on a project for a company. And those are little ways you can start making little tiny baby step inroads into that new career. But I do want to be realistic. I would not be, I would be selling you a false bill of goods if I was like, yeah, sure, tons of 2-year MBA programs are open to 38 and 40-year-olds. Like, they're totally into it. And McKinsey and Goldman Sachs, they love 42-year-old MBA graduates. It's certainly possible, but it's not the norm. So uh, maybe I apologize if that's not what you want to hear, but maybe I just saved you a lot of time and effort and money. I would hate for you to enroll in an MBA program and take out the $150,000 of debt and then find out that it's not going to get you where you want to go. And this is why, for every person, it's important to do this career homework that I talk about in Applicant Lab, and I give you some instructions on how to do it in a lab. Like, do that homework. Like, reach out to people, because the worst thing would be for you to go, most people graduate with $100,000 of debt. That's the average. Some people graduate with $170,000, $200,000 of debt from the MBA. What a tragedy it would be for you to put in all this effort, take out the loans, quit your job, do all this stuff, and then you find out once you're there that, oh, that career pivot that I thought I could make actually isn't possible. Okay, the next question. Hello, how many applications typically reviewed after submission? Do schools compare candidates by industry and compare candidates by GMAT score and GPA? So, how are applications typically reviewed after submission? I'm not sure if you were here earlier in the presentation, but I covered this. Most schools, at least within the US, at least sort of like the top programs, will have at least 2 readers per application. Those readers will spend roughly 5 to 10 minutes on that first read through, making an initial like, yes, we should further this person along in consideration, or no, we shouldn't. And then if the 2 readers disagree and one says yes and one says no, then usually a third person, usually a more senior person in the AdCom group, will then review, and then they will have the final say as to whether or not we bring that person in for an interview or not. Do schools compare candidates by industry and GMAT score and GPA? The answer is yes. All of the above. So GMAT score and GPA are absolutely things that are they ask for them in the application because they are things that you are going to be evaluated on. Pardon me for a moment. Again, I'm trying so hard to not go to the Kleenex, but like, of course you're going to be looked at with your GPA. And so for example, one thing that might be useful is, for example, if you are applying with a GMAT score, you might want to look up on the GMAT website. They tend to publish each year like the average GMAT scores by country. So you might want to try to find that data. It's usually publicly available. And so if you're from a certain country and you look at the average GMAT score and you're from a country where that GMAT score average from your country tends to be higher, let's say it's 30 points higher, then that's a good indicator to you that, for example, if a school says, well, our average GMAT of our entering class is 710, but you're from a country that tends to score 30 points higher, then that's a good indicator to you that a competitive score for that school might be more like 30 points more than 710, which is 740. So you are compared against other people in your bucket in terms of the test scores. I apologize. Um, for test scores, for sure. GPAs, yes, but GPAs for me are a little bit more fluid. Just because a GPA can vary, I mean, it depends on the college you go to. It depends on what you major in. Someone who gets a 3.0 in neurobiomechanics at MIT is probably smarter than someone who got a perfect 4.0 in, I don't know, Kleenex origami at Maria's correspondence college, right? So like I really, of all the things that people talk about in this process, the emphasis on GPA is, I think, almost meaningless in some ways. Obviously, if you like failed a bunch of classes or got really bad grades, like that might be a problem for sure. But for the most part, I find GPA discussions to be kind of like, well, it's not even apples to oranges in some cases. In some cases, it's like apples to, I don't know, cantaloupes or I don't know, bananas or other sorts of. So it's like, but so that's why the standardized test scores are so valuable. Um, so think about that. And then, yes, within your industry, if people are, let's say, software engineers, I'm going to compare the software engineers against each other. And so if someone's a software engineer and they're really smart and they have, let's say they have a 760 on the GMAT, but all they've ever done is work by themselves in a cubicle and code in a little dungeon. And another person uh, is leading a product management team of 5 other people and has helped launch 3 new products that have helped, create new revenue streams for their company. That person has more of those EQ leadership skills. And in fact, counterintuitively, and this is why sort of my little hierarchy of needs is a useful thing to think about. If that, let's say the person who's to only work by themselves and they code, and they're very, very smart, but they don't have interpersonal skills versus someone else who has amazing leadership skills, who has helped like convince the CEO of their company to launch a new division. And like, even if that person has like, say a 720 GMAT or a 700 GMAT, like because that person's interpersonal and leadership skills are so strong, it might actually counterbalance a lower than average GMAT score. So, but that's very rare. I mean, that requires a really like a moment where someone reads the resume and goes, "Wow!" Right? So all else being equal, most sort of solid candidates within their bucket are going to be compared on primarily like the GMAT or the GRE score, because at a certain point, like every management consultant kind of looks the same after a while, and every I don't know, mergers and acquisitions analyst after a while, like, oh, this person did 7 DCF models and this person did 6 DCF models, and it's kind of all looking the same. So if one of them has a 760 and one of them has a 670, you know admissions readers are human, so you would probably choose the person with the 762. So yeah, you are going to be looked in your bucket if that was your question. Oh, Emmanuel, a lot more attention is paid to students who would be job seeking at the end of the program and not to gets me wondering if the curricula are biased. I mean, Emmanuel, 50% of Harvard Business School graduates go on to found a company. And as a result, Harvard Business School really emphasizes entrepreneurship, and most business schools really emphasize entrepreneurship. So I'm not sure why, if the curricula are biased, if you think the curriculum, like if you look at the curriculum of a business school and you don't think that it provides the entrepreneurial lessons that you are looking for, great. I'm so glad that you do that research now before you apply and before you enroll. Because again, the worst thing is like if somebody enrolls in a program and takes out all that debt and then they realize like womp womp, this isn't what I wanted at all. Um, but the curricula, the startup and entrepreneurial curricula at most business schools is pretty strong because most business schools realize that even if somebody does not start a company in their careers, entrepreneurial thinking, design thinking, customer discovery, all of these things, this is useful in pretty much any company, even if you go to work for a huge company, right? Entrepreneurial thinking is useful even if you go to work at Apple. And it's going to be useful even if you go to work at a bank, right? I attended a conference several months ago, hosted by JP Morgan, where they were talking about like, oh, maybe it was last year actually. I don't know. I sort of things, my head's fuzzy. Anyway, the point is like JP Morgan was talking about like all these AI things that they're incorporating into like literally every facet of their workflow. JP Morgan, one of the world's most established, oldest, stodgiest banks, they need entrepreneurial thinkers to think about how are we going to implement AI in our big bank. So most business schools are teaching a tremendous amount of entrepreneurship. It is a huge focus. Schools that maybe weren't teaching it 5-10 years ago are now they're teaching it now. So I'm not sure what you meant by I wonder if the curricula are biased, but I don't think so, right? Most business schools see entrepreneurship as an incredibly useful thing to teach, and this is. But I will say, like with anything, whether we're talking entrepreneurship, innovation, real estate, healthcare, you know, environmental sustainability, no matter what the facet of business is, entertainment and media is another one, the schools can vary tremendously between them. So it really is in everyone's best interest when you're doing your research for your schools to research like what are the offerings a school has in especially in that elective curriculum in those electives that they teach. So if a school has, for example, a major or a concentration area in something like real estate or innovation or whatever it is that interests you, that's a pretty good sign that they're going to have the resources that you want. So make sure when you're applying to schools, if we think back to the point I was trying to make earlier about the gears fitting together, if your career vision is entrepreneurship and you're applying to a school that only has like a kind of like a half-baked entrepreneurial offering, like, oh, those gears aren't going to go together. But if you're applying with an entrepreneurial sort of vision and then, but you're applying to a school that like, you know, has a ton of entrepreneurship stuff, then great. Now those gears are there. Everything is merrily rolling along in a positive way. All right, what's the next question? I just need to check. I need to see if my kid's waiting for me at school, but I think he hasn't texted me yet, so I'm gonna maybe in 10 minutes I'll have to leave and pick him up. I'm late picking him up, so. Okay. AP wants to know, how do you address career breaks to MBA outcomes, and how do you address startup co-founding alongside full-time paid employment? I'll do the second one first because it's the easier one, KP. If you have a side hustle or a side gig, I do not put those at the same time as full-time employment. I don't put them like in the resume in the same place. I actually put them in a separate section underneath, like near the bottom, called like the additional section. And the reason for that is that when I am reading a resume, if somebody has like a full-time employment, and then let's say they describe their full-time employment on the resume, and then underneath that, they've got co-founder of a startup, and then I look at the dates and the dates overlap, and that's when I have that record scratch moment that I talked about earlier. That's when I have that cognitive break, and I'm like, wait, you can't have two full-time jobs at once. So what's going on here? And it's so my thing is like, if a job is where you are spending the bulk of your energy, or if it's where you're receiving your income, that is a full-time job, and that goes under the experience section of the resume. Why is my hand getting fuzzy? That's weird. Am I in a multiverse? There must be some sort of a weird blurry background thing. Anyway, sorry for the multiverse. So I would put your full-time job in a separate section, and then the startup side things, I would put them separately, because otherwise it's like I then start looking at the day. And that's where, again, if we think about the fact that I'm going to spend 5 to 10 minutes on that first read through, just make it as easy and as smooth for me to understand as possible. So I break those out into two separate sections. Career breaks for MBA adcoms. So many schools in the application form itself have a specific question that says, have you, since graduating from college or graduate school, have you been unemployed for a period of 3 months or more? And if so, explain. So it might vary from like some schools might say if you've been unemployed for 6 months or more or 3 months, but I think it's usually something like 3 months or more. If you've been unemployed for 3 months or more, explain, and they'll give you a little text box. And that's where you usually will explain it. If the school does not have that in their application form, you will describe that in something called the optional essay, which is like the sort of kitchen sink catch-all essay where you just, explain anything that you're a little bit worried about. Like if maybe your grades in college weren't so great because you were working to support your family, or maybe, you had a job that you were only at that job for a couple months and then you left because it wasn't the right fit and you're a little bit worried about how they might perceive that. The optional essay is normally where you kind of explain what happened there. But a specific career break, like a time that you have been not employed, they want to know about that, and so they will ask usually a separate question just about that. All right, I've got about 5 minutes left. Is there any other question? Sorry, I just silenced myself so you didn't have to hear me swallowing. Irvin wants to know, can I reuse the essays and recommendation letters if I reapply? So again, this varies from school to school. Some schools will specifically say like, okay, if you're a reapplicant, here's exactly what we want you to do. We have a separate essay that's just for reapplicants. However, some schools are just like, whatever, you can submit the same thing. I'm gonna answer your question with a question, Arvin. And my question is, if your essays the first time around were strong, like really good, wouldn't you have gotten in the first time? So I don't know why anyone would want to reuse if you applied and you didn't get in. Why reuse, right? Like why would you reuse it? No, don't reuse it. I mean, you can, but I'm not sure why I wouldn't. I don't know. With the help of Applicant Lab, can I be ready to submit applications to my schools of choice within a month? How involved are you in the process of preparation? So yeah, some people sign up for Applicant Lab and it depends on how much. It depends on how much work have you already done on the app. Like how much have you educated yourself? Like if someone they have not started and like they haven't done any career vision homework, they haven't even thought about what their career vision is, they haven't even started looking at schools yet, they haven't even asked their recommender like to be a recommender, like that'll be harder. But there have been people who have signed up for the lab and maybe they cancel their weekend plans for a few weekends. Maybe they take a few days off of work. But people have powered through Applicant Lab in a week or two. And I'm not saying that that's like the norm for everyone. I mean, you have to be really self-disciplined and a pretty strong writer, for example. But it's definitely possible. I think on some of the GMAT club reviews, I think I've got some people who say things like, "Oh, I used the lab and in a week I was able to put together several applications." I just to be realistic though and not oversell it. Like I suspect that sometimes when people say I did it in a week, they might have done it like if they were applying round 2, which is early January, they might have done that week between like say Christmas and New Year's when a lot of employers give the week. I don't know, but yeah, it's up to you. Like, can you be ready to submit within a month? That's up to you in terms of how much time and energy are you going to devote to it. How involved am I in the process of preparation? So to be clear, the reason that Applicant Lab costs 1/30th of what I would otherwise charge is because it's an online tool. So I don't know if you remember the little dashboard that I showed. It's a series of online exercises and videos that I have created. But just to be, and if you have a question as you go through, if something in the lab is like not clear, you can of course reach out to me. For the past couple of days, anyone who has reached out, I have been so sick and unconscious on my bed, sneezing. I have not, but usually there's at the support inbox, like I am manning the inbox. And so if something's not clear, I will respond. But sometimes if someone's like, "Oh, I don't understand how to do this," I'll say like, "Oh, well, go back to this section and take a look." But the idea is that Applicant Lab, the reason it costs 1/30th or 1/50th as much is that you're not going to get you don't get live time with me, right? It's an online tool. It's like a, you know, like a an online test prep course as opposed to working one-on-one with a tutor. Um, so I am available. I am a real person. I am available. I do answer the support inbox when I'm not unconscious with the flu on my bed. But assuming that I'm awake, I do try to answer the support inbox. But to be clear, you're not working with me. I mean, if you, I would have to charge my what I'm worth for that to happen. Um, oh, Mr. Greetune234. Oh, I don't know who you are, Mr. Great Tone 234, but thank you for the um Applicant Lab is awesome. I used the lab as a two-time reapplicant and got it into a T15 with a 60% scholarship. The resume section and the school-specific advice, especially Ross and Fuqua, are awesome. Oh, thank you, Mr. That was I did not plan that, Mr. Greetune. Mr. Great Tune. Um, any advice regarding round 3 next year versus round 1? Yes, my advice is normally don't bother with round 3. Now, I know that's like you're like, "That's really brusque. She normally talks a lot, and that was a really short answer for someone who talks a lot." Uh, so a couple of things. First of all, it depends on, whether or not you will need a visa, a student visa to get into the US. So, if you do need a student visa to get into the US, it may be really hard to get in around 3, not because the schools are being mean, but because they've been burned in the past. They let someone in, you apply in round 3, let's say March, you find out in April, May, you apply then for the student visa, and the embassy doesn't grant the visa, classes start in August, and the student cannot join. So if someone needs a student visa, especially from a country that it is difficult to get a visa from, to work in and this is not, I mean, I know that I tend to speak in US centric terms, but the same is true for Canada, UK, EU, wherever it is that you might be, Singapore, wherever it is that you're looking to study. Now, if that's not an issue for round 3, it's interesting, right? Because the schools have had the COVID just messed I mean, again, thanks a lot, Einstein, Maria. COVID messed everything up. I know. I'm just a font of wisdom. COVID like completely messed everything up. And so, application numbers have been like on this complete roller coaster the past couple years. Um, so application numbers have been sort of down from domestic applicants this past couple years. So like maybe round 3 is it's more likely to yield a successful result than it has been in the past. However, I still think it's kind of risky. If you can wait, it's so much better to just apply in round 1. Because let's say you apply in round 3 and they love you, but they're like, "Oh no, but we already filled up all of our spaces." They've got seats on the bus, and they're like, okay, we've got some seats on the bus for consultants and some seats on the bus for bankers and some seats on the bus for engineers. Some are software engineers, some are oil and gas engineers, some are mechanical engineers. Usually most of the seats on the bus are filled up with round 1 and round 2. So by round 3, not a lot of seats are left. The people who tend to be the most successful in round 3 are those who either have like a more unique-ish background, because if they've already gotten a flood of applicants just like you in rounds 1 and 2, they've probably filled those spaces with that flood of applicants. But for example, someone that I know who did get in round 3 was someone who was like, I think once like a journalist for the BBC, right? Like someone who has like a really like, wow, this sort of person doesn't normally apply, and they might have a really interesting perspective to share with the class. Someone who was in the military who was deployed, and therefore when they fill in their application, they're like, I couldn't submit in rounds 1 and 2 because I was I was on a submarine or whatever it is. That might work as well, but for the most part, by round 3, the seats on the bus are taken. And so you can apply, but then it's like, then you have to reapply. And since most schools, when you reapply, they ask like, what has changed since the time you last applied? It's totally cool to be like, well, I applied 3 months ago, so not a whole lot has changed. But it's also like, well, I don't know, why bother? So if you are kind of like indifferent, it's like you can throw in a Hail Mary for round 3, but just realize it might not work out, and you might find yourself reapplying in round 1 anyway. So your energy might be better saved if you just wait for round one and take things with calm and slowly and submit your best stuff in round one of next year. Okay. I think that's all I've got. I think I have a child that I have is probably wondering if I have abandoned him to the wolves. So I do need to go. It's 5:30 p.m. for me where I am. So I probably need to go pick him up from school. But I think I got through all of the questions. So thank you so much. If you did find this useful, again, as it says at the bottom, please like this video, because when you like the video, that tells the YouTube algorithm genies that this is a good video to watch. And then GMAT Club gets more subscribers to its YouTube channel. And then they can ask me back again to do more of these things. So let's keep that algorithmic good karma going by liking and sharing this video as much as possible. And do check out applicantlab.com if you have a chance. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.